All right, welcome to Antisemitism, Understanding and Countering This Hatred today. This session is being facilitated by Kim Klett. It's a pleasure to have you here today, Kim. Let me just share a little bit about you. Kim is a senior facilitator for Echoes of Reflections who has taught English in Mesa, Arizona for 31 years. She developed a semester-long, now year-long, Holocaust literature class in 2000 and teaches a class at Scottsdale Community College on the Holocaust. Ms. Klett is a museum teacher fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a teacher ambassador for Defiant Requiem, a Pathways for Peace fellow, and a teaching hard history teacher with Learning for Justice. She serves on the board of the Phoenix Holocaust Association. In addition, she is the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights, working with teachers in post-conflict societies such as Bosnia and Rwanda. Thanks so much for being here today, Kim, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joan. And thank you for attending. We're going to talk about a little bit about the historical aspect of anti-Semitism, but also today and what we're seeing today. I think that when you're going to talk about this topic, that you do need to share with your students a little bit of the background. And so we'll look at a little bit of that, but really focusing on what we're seeing today. So Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and author of Night, said, "Once I thought that anti-Semitism had ended. Today it is clear to me that it will probably never end." It is called the longest hatred. Again, historically, it goes back to biblical times. And it's something that, it never seems to end. Every time we think it's getting better, we have these waves where it goes back. So definitely an important topic today. Samantha Power, who was the UN ambassador, United States UN ambassador in the past, said, "Rising anti-Semitism is rarely the lone or the last expression of intolerance in society." So it's one of many forms of hatred, unfortunately, but we definitely see it. And again, sometimes you might have people who question, why are you focusing on the Holocaust? Why are you talking about anti-Semitism? There are other forms of hatred. There are other forms of intolerance. Why this? And I think this and the next slide are good answers to that. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality." And so again, if students or parents or anybody's asking why you're focusing on this, it does all connect, right? And we're not saying that anti-Semitism is worse than any other form of hatred, but it's out there, and our students do see it, especially on social media, and probably have questions about it. And it's something that is important to look at. This is a review that ADL did recently. They do this every year, and it just really shows the uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. And if you go to the ADL's website, you can find the whole report that this comes from, and it breaks it down into, the kinds of incidents. Some are violence, some are, threats. Some are flyers, things like that come out. We're going to be looking at some of those examples in this session, but it's definitely on an upward swing, unfortunately, and has gone up in huge numbers, as you can see here. So again, welcome. Just to tell you a little bit about Echoes and Reflections. We are a conglomeration of the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, that I just mentioned. They've been around for over 100 years, fighting for the civil rights of all people. We also work with the USC Shoah Foundation. They provide our visual history testimonies of survivors. Steven Spielberg started that organization after he made Schindler's List. And he realized how many survivors had not had their stories recorded. So he made that his mission. And now they have over 54,000 testimonies recorded. They also have other genocides that have been recorded, survivors of those as well. And then we also work with Yad Vashem, which is the memorial and museum in Jerusalem, Israel. And they provide a lot of our lessons and our primary source materials. We have worked with more than 125,000 educators across the country since this came out in 2005. And I will be taking you in a little bit to the website. Please feel free to jump in. You can unmute yourselves if you have a question anywhere along the way. If you need me to clarify something, if you need me to go back, I want you to feel comfortable going to our website and using the materials there, because I think you'll find them really well done. So our objectives for our short time together today are to define contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism, both different and the same as traditional forms, present before and during the Holocaust. I will be sharing those classroom resources with you that highlight the persistence and impact of anti-Semitism worldwide. We will explore ways to support students' ability to recognize and actively respond to anti-Semitism in an effort to prevent bigotry, intolerance, and other forms of prejudice. And then, of course, we want to build your confidence and capacity to discuss and teach this complex subject. We always start with our pedagogical principles. I'm going to go over these rather quickly, but I want you to be thinking about, and maybe you could even jot them down, any that you think you do really well in the classroom already, and those that you might want to work on. Okay, so we always want to make sure we're clear with our terms, that we're defining the terms, that we provide background on the history of anti-Semitism when we're teaching about the Holocaust, that we contextualize the history, that we make sure that students know if we're teaching like a book like Night by Elie Wiesel, the context around it. He's focused on Hungary and mostly 1944 and 45, what's happening outside of that world. He goes to Auschwitz, what's happening in other camps, what's happening in the ghettos, right? And contextualizing that history. We want to teach the human story, and those testimonies that I was talking about really help us do that. They put faces and names to the numbers. We want to use primary source materials. All of our lessons include those. We want to try to make the Holocaust relevant for our students. We'll talk about that a little bit today, because that's a difficult one sometimes to do. Encourage inquiry-based learning and critical thinking. All of our lessons are built upon that. We want to try to foster empathy. And again, that one's hard. You can't measure empathy, but I think our lessons really help build that in the classroom. And then we want to ensure that supportive learning environment. We want to bring the students safely into this study and take them safely out. We don't want to bombard them with graphic images. We don't want to scare them. We want to keep that safe space of the classroom. All right. So I'll be taking you to the unit. Usually you're going to go to the teach column, and then you get these units. The units, as you can see, go kind of in chronological order. So you have studying the Holocaust. There's anti-Semitism. This focuses on historical anti-Semitism. We have Nazi Germany, the ghettos, the final solution, Jewish resistance, rescuers and non-Jewish resistance, survivors and liberators, perpetrators, collaborators, and bystanders. The children, oh, sorry, this is an old one. I just realized that. I need to change a slide. That last unit has changed. And then we have the contemporary anti-Semitism unit. And then we also have a brand new unit that I just presented in the last session. It's called Teaching About Genocide. So keep that in mind. So we're going to start with looking at just this example of the definition and the historical aspect of anti-Semitism. So go ahead and read this definition on your own. Is there anything that stands out to you or anything that you have questions on with this definition? One of the things that I always want to focus on with students is this idea of seeing people as a concept, because that seems like it's dehumanizing, and it can be. But it also can be something like my students, for example, most of them don't know a Jewish person. They unless they've met a survivor, they typically don't know somebody who's Jewish. And so to them, the Jews might be a concept, right? They've never met a Jewish person. And so it's this idea, which can also be built from stereotypes, right? So it can be very dangerous. So I look at this definition with my students, and we always talk about this piece of it. You also have, like I said, this long history. This is just a very short, condensed definition. In our unit on anti-Semitism, we have an article that's 2 pages that goes into that a little bit more. So just so you know that. And then again, like I said, stereotypes often come from this, that oversimplified generalization about a person or a group of people without regard for individual differences. If I ask my students on the first day, if I were to ask them, describe a Jewish person, they would probably say that the male would have a beard and he'd wear a hat or a yarmulke. They're going to have some of those kinds of stereotypes because that's what they've seen. That's all they know. And it is oversimplified, right? It is a generalization. Not all Jewish people look like that, right? So it's important to talk about those stereotypes with the kids and kind of get those out of the way as well. So I want to take you next to the unit on anti-Semitism. So we're going to shift gears here just a little bit. And if you want to follow along, you may. It's just echoesandreflections.org, or you can watch on my screen. That's fine too. So when you open up echoesandreflections.org, it's loading for you. There it is. It's going to look like this. And as I said, you're going to want to go to the Teach on the menu bar. And that's where you get those lesson plans. So you click on that. Like I said, we're going to go to anti-Semitism. Every unit is set up exactly the same way. So you have a quote from one of the survivors. You have a glossary of words. These keywords are unique to every unit. So every unit has, there might be a little overlap, but they are unique for the units. This is where you get all of your background information. It's great for teachers. If you're new to teaching about it, it breaks it down, everything you need. You've got your essential questions, your objectives, again, all the background information. You also have this great video toolbox, which has a 15-minute video. Most of the units have this. And it's really for you as a teacher to watch, just to add to your background knowledge on this subject of anti-Semitism. It's created by our partners at Yad Vashem. And, but I do know some teachers who use them in the classroom. I would say watch it first and, see if it fits for your students. You have your academic standards for every unit and every lesson. It breaks it down either for social studies or ELA. So that's really handy to have as well. And then it breaks it down into the lessons, right? So you have this anti-Semitism before the Holocaust, this kind of history. Here we have our testimonies. We're going to watch one of these in just a minute. There's that stereotype, right? There's a graphic organizer for it. Each lesson is just really rich. There's that definition of anti-Semitism. And then here's that longer article that's 2 pages that you could do with your students. And again, you have timelines, you have all kinds of interesting things here. But I want to go back and show you a very short video clip. We're going to watch Mr. Sinison here. And I want you to think about, he's going to be talking about, like pre-1933, of what it was like for his family living in Germany, being Jewish. And I want you to think about that first of all. Each of these has a very short bio. I always read these to my students. So he was born in 1925 in Berlin, Germany. He did not end up going to any ghettos or concentration camps because in 1939, he and his brother were able to flee to France and they lived there with their uncle. Of course, the Nazis entered France, occupied, and so he and his brother were sent to an orphanage, and then eventually they made it to the US. And he was 14 years old when the war began. This is where you might get some of that relevancy with your students, because if they're 14 or they've been 14, they might be like, oh, wow, okay, he was 14 when this was happening, and I'm 14. What might that be like? It might pique their interest a little bit. So again, think about his life and how he describes it before the Nazis come into power.
Kim, can you make sure you shared the audio?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I forgot to do that this time. I've done it all day and then forgot. Sorry, let me stop the share and reshare. Thank you. Okay, and I'll start over so you can hear it. Let's see. There we go.
We lived in the center of Berlin.
Okay,
My parents were upper middle class. My father was a sales representative for a large textile mill. He earned a very nice living. We had a nice apartment. The ambience was cultured. We had music. I remember my parents dressing up in evening clothes and going to the opera. We had theater, and they would take us along. We were comfortable economically, at least before the National Socialist regime took over in Germany. I'm talking about the early years that I remember, in the early 1930s, before 1933. My father, in particular, was German first and Jewish second. Now, this does not mean that he was not an observant Jew. We were what was then called observant. In this country, in the USA, this can be translated into conservative. We observed all the holidays. We went to services Friday night and Saturday morning. If my father didn't have to work, he made sure that I went and my brother went. We both, my brother and I, sang in the synagogue choir. Usually the synagogues had boys' choirs. We celebrated all the holidays. My father never worked on the holidays. We were, without keeping a kosher home, yet we observed all the traditions.
So again, they had a normal life, right? Anything that stood out to you, and you can unmute if you'd like or share it in the chat, anything that stood out to you that he said? For my students, they go ahead, please.
Well, I was just gonna say, for me, it was when he said his father was German first.
Yes, and Jewish second.
Yeah.
And it's funny because that's exactly what my students always connect to as well. They have the national identity before the religious. And when I ask the kids, it's like, do you identify, would you say, that you're American first, or are you, Catholic or whatever religion you might be? And they're like, oh yeah, that's true. Right. And so they get what he's saying. I think that's an important piece, that they, really did see themselves as Germans. And that's why it's such a shock when their citizenship is taken away. Some of the things that you do need to break down with his testimony, and again, that's why that glossary is handy, but you might need to, like when he says that his family was conservative, my kids think politics, right? And so I have to explain, no, that's in the Jewish faith, so like he said, they weren't super strict. They did keep kosher. I have to explain that as well. But they really only, went to synagogue on holidays and such. He was in the choir, so things like that. They were connected, but not, it wasn't their world, right? And so I do have to explain those things to them. But again, it's that life before. He had this normal, German life at the time. So his is interesting. Not all of them are like this, but he has a second part here. And with this one, I want you to think about, okay, now things start to ramp up. And he does experience anti-Semitism. His family does. And so kind of watch his body language, think about his word choice, think about the intonations of his voice as you're watching this second short clip.
It so happened that the best school in the neighborhood where we lived, in terms of academic work and also the most convenient, was a Catholic elementary school. Now, Catholic elementary schools were supported by the Catholic Diocese of Berlin, but they were not, as in this country, taught by nuns or brothers. They were lay teachers. And basically, they had the same curriculum as the city schools, with the exception that after regular classes, there was a class in catechism. And the Jewish kids in the school, and there were a dozen or so, were excused from that, and we could go home early. And we did. Now, this was about 1931 and 1932. In 1933, when the Nazis came to power, this started to change, because my classmates, who were my little friends, and we visited each other and played together and did our homework together and what have you, must have picked up new vibrations at home, because suddenly they called us dirty Jew, they called us other names. They would not play with us. They would not invite us. Some of their parents would telephone my parents and say, I hope you understand, but if my son plays with your son and his other friends will, yeah, etc. They knew what was going on. They made excuses, but it didn't stop. It was not an official policy of the school. The teachers were very fair. This was never permitted in class. There was never any reference in class to anything like that, unless the public schools, where the anti-Semitism had become suddenly very rampant.
And so for Mr. Sinison, that distinction is really important, that he was in this Catholic school where, it was different. And so this is a great point to make with students, because they'll ask about that, about the anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany and how far reaching it was. And it was very far reaching into the public schools, where they had textbooks that were rewritten to follow the Nazi ideology. The teachers were trained, to teach these lessons that were very military based and, anti-Semitic as well. So it's important to make that distinction, that he was at this Catholic school, but still friends saying, can't play with you anymore, calling him those names, right? The parents being apologetic. And that brings up too the question about bystanders, because the kids want to know a lot about that as well. Well, there's an example, right? The parents, they know it's wrong. They're calling his parents and kind of apologizing, and yet still doing it, right? Like, yeah, we have to go along with this. Any other thoughts or questions with Mr. Sinison? And again, you can unmute if that's easier. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and take you back to the PowerPoint for just a few more minutes. Go. All right, so we were looking at stereotyping last. I'm going to put it on slideshow mode. go. We're not going to watch Margaret because we did Mr. Sinison instead. There we go. And a reminder of that quote from Elie Wiesel, right? It will probably never end with this anti-Semitism. Professor Peter Hayes. So we've been looking at historical anti-Semitism. This is going to bring it a little more into the forward, because I think the question comes up, like, why does it still continue, right? We know that these beliefs that people have about Jews are wrong. We know that, you know, they can be disproved, and yet people will still bring up some of these tropes against the Jews. People are still anti-Semitic. And so Dr. Peter Hayes, who's at Northwestern University, has a really interesting commentary. And this is in the unit. When we go back to it, I'll show you where to find it. Again, just a short video clip about where this comes from.
Anti-Semitism is a riddle. It is hard to explain why a cultural tradition would become so fixated on a particular group of people as a source of its problems. Now, we know why in the Western cultural tradition this hatred exists. It's rooted in a religious rivalry. It's rooted in the sense that Christianity developed, that it had superseded Judaism, that it therefore had replaced it. And those people who clung to Judaism were dangerous to the faith of the people who had not, who had embraced Christianity. And thus these people were regarded as contaminating. They had to be kept at a distance. They had to be confined. We know where this tradition came from. But what is striking is that in the modern world, which is a largely secular world in the West, this hatred keeps morphing. It keeps shape-shifting. It shifts to other kinds of justifications. And that, I think, is the thing about anti-Semitism that I regard as different from the motivations of other perceived genocides. The motive is protean. The motive keeps changing shape, but the hatred is the constant element. I do believe that anti-Semitism is a kind of superstition. So to try to understand why people are anti-Semitic, one has to understand, why are people superstitious? One of the reasons is, of course, because generations before them taught them to be, have said that if you, in fact, want to ward off some event that you don't want to happen to you, you knock on wood. We all know that knocking on wood is not efficacious, and yet we somehow think that it's a safe thing to do just in case. With regard to anti-Semitism, there is this kind of fixation on these people as being hyper-dangerous, and thus they have to be confined or reconfined in order for our lives to be safe. There is no empirical rationality behind that. There is no demonstration behind that. It is a form of knocking on wood. And to explain it any further than that is, of course, very difficult, because superstitions are almost impossible to account for.
All right. He's exactly right, isn't he? I love his connection to knocking on wood. My students saw me do that all the time. You know, it's just something we do, right? We know it doesn't work, but we do it. And I think that a lot of times those hatreds come from that same kind of place, right? We don't understand it, but it's always been that way. And so it's always going to be that way, right? Until we question it, because we certainly can. Any other thoughts or questions on Dr. Hayes? This is a graphic organizer that you can use. It's in our unit and on a contemporary anti-Semitism that I'll take you to in just a few minutes. But it's, I think, really good where you can have students look at, you know, how has it been expressed over time. You can look at examples of it, and then you've got this organizer. Examples of Jews being isolated or segregated, and they can list them. Jews being dehumanized, right? And all of these they could see in the Holocaust, and then going back to these historical roots where they see it even more so. This I'm not going to take you to, but it is on our website. This is something where if you wanted students to do a little research, they could look at, where this is coming from today. A couple of these are a little dated, like this FBI hate crime statistics. You might be able to find a more recent update to that. This is from 2019, but it's rather chilling. This is related to what we looked at the beginning, the audit of anti-Semitic incidents. That one's from 2021 from ADL. This heat map is really good because you could take it, you all are in Nevada, I'm in Arizona. You can take the students to the map of the United States and see where incidents are happening. I did this last spring. I was in New Jersey with a group of teachers, and they found it really interesting that in New Jersey, they had, oh gosh, I want to say it was at least like 300 or 400 incidents in a year of anti-Semitism. And we looked at my state of Arizona and we had 53. And so it was just interesting talking about why is that, what causes some of these things. And it was just a really interesting conversation. So those are some resources. They're on the website. I'll show you where to find those. This is another one. This one's not on our website, but ADL has a series called Anti-Semitism Uncovered that goes through some of these old tropes and walks you through them. And that's something I didn't use this one with my students, but you certainly could. And so let's look at some examples of what's happening. These are pretty recent. And you may remember these, you may not, but they're pretty recent. So January of last year, 2022, there was a man, basically a hostage situation in Colleyville, Texas, a suburb of Dallas. Luckily, he didn't kill or injure anybody, but he was taken down by, I believe, the police in the end. And I think it was like an 11-hour standoff, right? So, and this was at a synagogue. So terrifying. We see things, and again, our students are seeing these kinds of things in the news. Rallies. These are constant. This goes back to 2017 with Unite the Right, where you saw Nazi swastika flags, Confederate flags, Nazi, they're not in this picture, but Nazi uniforms were present, and one woman was killed. So you see things like this. This just happened this year. Earlier in the year, there were 2 men. Luckily, it was not lethal, but they were shot in Los Angeles. And this is an area where there are a lot of Jewish people. And the guy who did it, they went back and were looking at his, searches on his computer. And he had been looking for like kosher delis and things like that. He was specifically targeting Jewish people and did shoot 2 men. This is graffiti in Royal Oak, Michigan, at a shul or school, a Jewish school. And again, this was from this year. And the reference is to it's interesting, it's a Ukrainian anti-Semitic group. So I don't know if they were, considered themselves a part of that group or saw it and tagged it that way, but again, the swastika. These were flyers in Atlanta, Georgia, again from this year. Leo Frank was a Jewish man from Atlanta who in the early 20th century was accused of murder. Notice it's cut off, but it says pedophile Leo Frank. Again, this is from the early 1900s. But he was accused of killing a 13-year-old girl. He clearly was not guilty, and yet he was lynched. There's a Broadway play right now called, well, it's been around for a while, but it's been on Broadway called Parade, that is based on his story. Here's another one. The corn has nothing to do with it. It's just put in to hold the bags down. Some people, like here in Arizona, they put rocks in the bags. But, here again, tying Jews to Satan, right? The Talmud, the religious book. So our kids, might have things like this put in their driveways, or they might see them on light poles. This one, my kids were all over with Kanye, right? Is right. Kanye West put out a lot of anti-Semitic tweets and other things in the past year. And my students saw all of that. It was very prevalent on social media. And so you saw tables set up like this. So I'm going to take you back to the website for this part. Any questions so far or thoughts? Okay, again, feel free to unmute if you do. Make sure I'm getting everything that you need. So we're going to go back to Echoes and Reflections. So let me share that page again. And this time we're going to go, so we were in the anti-Semitism, the historical unit. I want to go back. Actually, I'm going to go back this way. So when we go to our lesson plans, we're going to go to this green glass unit on contemporary anti-Semitism. So like I said, it's set up exactly the same way as what we saw before in Unit 2. And then it breaks it down into lessons. So the first lesson is the enduring problem of anti-Semitism. And again, just like the other unit, you get handouts, you get testimonies, more handouts, like just so much stuff and questions. This is where you get the handout that had like the FBI and the heat map and such, if you want to check that out. And then it comes into the new anti-Semitism. And this is where we're going to look next. I don't know, my students didn't remember this, but you might. In 2018, it was in October 27th. This man entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he was yelling, "All Jews must die." He opened fire on the congregants, killed 11, wounded 6 others. He told a law enforcement officer that Jews were committing genocide against his people. Authorities later found virulent anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and anti-immigrant posts on his social media profiles. The last of his posts reflect his belief that Jews are enabling undocumented immigrants to enter the U.S. They stated that Jewish organizations like to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. The Tree of Life shooting is the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in U.S. history. So knowing that, let's look at this word cloud. This is really interesting. So with word clouds, if you've used them before, you know that when words are found several times, it makes them bigger, right? And so that's what you'll notice on this. So they looked at his social media and put in the words that they were seeing. And so things like Jews and Jewish came up a lot. Invaders came up a lot, right? And then you can see other words, and they have some definitions over here, like these parentheses, they call that the echo sometimes. And it's used like if they're trying to point out that somebody's Jewish without saying it, they'll put the triple parentheses around that person's name or an organization. HIAS, which is still around, and it was founded in 1881. You see it over here. And they help refugees and provide assistance to them. The ADL we've talked about. There's APAC, MAGA, of course. So, you can see what this guy was putting on his social media. And this is what kind of, drove him. This is what was going through his mind, I suppose. He was just put on trial. Again, if you paid attention to the news, it was over the summer. He was given the death penalty. Hasn't been executed yet, but was given the death penalty for this. Any thoughts or questions as you look at this? My students found it really interesting. Some of them kidded that, it'd be interesting to look at their social media and see what words pop up, because they hadn't thought about that before, like things that we focus on or repeatedly post, in our social media, and what might come from that. But anyway, that is there. And then going back, I want to show you, we have partnered, like I said, with USC Shoah Foundation, and they have these activities. And I want to show you this one because it has a testimony that I want to share with you. This is one on contemporary anti-Semitism. And when you go to the USC Shoah Foundation website, well, that has my old email, but that's okay. You do have to register with them. But what's nice about it is that it gives you all this information, and your students can go on these by themselves to, look at different information, and then they answer questions. You can, like, here's one looking at historic anti-Semitism and images and things like that. Here's looking at today, graffiti. It's horrible. Here's another shooting with Copenhagen. And then they collect different videos and respond to them. So you can see there's lots of different people. And the kids are really exposed to a lot of different pieces here. And so anyway, it's a really good way to get your students to see the topic, right? So I wanted to share that with you. And then the one I wanted, though, was not in there. So let me see. You know what? Let me go back to the slideshow and see if it's in there. I thought it was. Yes. Okay. I think this will get us there. This is a man who was at Tree of Life the day that the shooting happened. And I think if I go to this, it will take us to his testimony. No, it is not a live link. Shoot. Okay. Well, anyway, he is through the USC Shoah Foundation. And so if you go on to their eyewitness website, you can find his testimony. But it's really a sad one, because he basically talks about he was a few minutes late getting to synagogue that day. And his housekeeper had shown up and was talking to him and kept him a little longer. And so he was late, but luckily he was late because it probably saved his life. And he pulls up to the synagogue, and a police officer knocks on his window and says, "You can't go in. There's been a shooting and you can't go in. It's not safe." And he basically says, like, "I thought going through the Holocaust was enough. Right? Now I have to go through this again. My family has to go through this again." And so it's a really powerful testimony. So I encourage you to use that in your classroom. And again, at the end of the session, if you have questions on how to get to eyewitness, I will show you how to do that. There's that word cloud again. So thinking about this anti-Semitism that's promoted by a lot of white nationalist groups today, how it's built on old ideas. Again, if we had a longer session, we would go into this more, because we have an article in that unit that I was just showing you on white nationalism and anti-Semitism and how they're tied together, but also different, right? There are some differences as well. This is Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt. She is an expert on anti-Semitism. If you saw the movie called Denial, It's her story. She wrote a book called Denying the Holocaust several years ago, where she named a man a denier, and he sued her for calling her a denier. So the film is really interesting. It's based on her story, and interesting to see how people can deny the Holocaust. We have a whole section on that in this unit as well. But she now is an ambassador, like a special envoy on anti-Semitism in the government. And so I want to show you her clip, but that one also is not live. Shoot. Okay, so hers is in the unit. Let me take you back. I'm sorry for the back and forth with this. I thought I had live links, but I don't. Okay, so echoes and reflections. There we go. So we're still in that same unit. And that'll pop up here for you. There we go. So that's where we were. And so here it gets into this section about denial and distortion. Okay. And her video is right here, Holocaust Denial Explained.
Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. The only reason to deny the Holocaust is to inculcate and foster anti-Semitism. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. So for anybody to disbelieve, they've got to come to it with some sort of preconceived notion. Holocaust denial takes different forms. And I divided into hardcore Holocaust denial and softcore Holocaust denial. Hardcore Holocaust denial is the argument made by deniers that there was no planned, centralized program of annihilation of the Jews by the Nazis. That this whole idea of eliminating the Jews from the European continent and beyond never happened. If you would ask them, well, why would the Jews make up this myth? Is that they did it for financial gain and to get the sympathy of the world in order to get a state. That in and of itself makes Holocaust denial a form of anti-Semitism, because the rationale they give to get money and to get a state are, of course, at the center of the stereotypes associated with anti-Semitism. But softcore denial does not deny the Holocaust. There were people who would say, well, of course the Holocaust happened, but was it really 6 million? Of course the Holocaust happened, but were there really gas chambers? I think any thoughtful person today knows that that's a ridiculous kind of thing. First of all, for deniers to be right, who has to be wrong? Well, certainly all the survivors. You have the bystanders. But most of all, you have the perpetrators. What they said was, I didn't do it. I was only following orders. So they had these different excuses, but they never said it didn't happen. The audience often are anti-Semites who are looking to have their feelings confirmed, or people who might not be overt anti-Semites, but somehow are discomforted with the idea of Jew as victim. This is an attack on society at large. In almost every society where they've gone after Jews first, they've gone after other people after that. Prejudice has to be fought, and amongst those prejudice, anti-Semitism has to be fought.
So again, any thoughts or questions on Deborah Lipstadt's video? And notice again, if you want to use that, I did use this in the classroom. I think she concisely states everything, and it's right here. The Holocaust Denial Explained. It is not one of these testimonies. Here you do have some survivors who talk about how they've experienced denial, which is interesting. And I've used those as well. Felix Sparks actually was a liberator. And then Marta Wise and Naomi Adler were survivors. And so you get some really interesting stories there. All right. The other part that I wanted to show you and that I wanted to end on is this last part of the lesson. And I'll just stay on the website for now to save confusion about where we are. This lesson, I think, is so important on action and agency, because we don't want our students just to end a unit like this with, oh my gosh, the world's a terrible place. There's nothing I can do. You know, it's just horrible. This is just going to keep continuing. And so we have some examples like here, profiles of young activists. So these are young people who have taken a stand against anti-Semitism. So, you know, this one focuses on a girl, a young woman who's at University of Virginia when the events of Charlottesville happened, and her speaking out against that. The next one is my favorite, a young man who is Iranian and Swedish, who stood up for a friend who was Jewish and a friend who was Roma or Gypsy. And, you know, later as a teenager, goes to Auschwitz-Birkenau and to Bergen-Belsen, and is very moved by this and realizes how, you know, his peers could learn from something like this. And so he starts arranging for his school to take students on such trips so that they can learn as well. And then he comes up with this organization that's now known as Young People Against Anti-Semitism and Xenophobia. And he's won many awards for his work. It's just, you know, and again, he's a young guy. And so it's relatable to kids. So you get these different profiles of real people, real young people who stood up against anti-Semitism. I did this one as a jigsaw activity. So different groups focused on one person and then shared out, you know, what they learned about that person. And then in addition to that, you have action planning for students that you can share with them, you know, and think about attitudes. Like if they're seeing anti-Semitism at their school, it could be something else as well. It could be racism, it could be sexism, it could be lots of different things. But getting to think about, where does that start? What's causing the problem? And then what do you see happening? And what would that look like? Who needs to be involved? So they have to really logistically think through it. And then what concrete behaviors can be taken to make this change actually happen and make it a reality. So I love that. This is another activity that I have done with students and really like, and it's scenarios, because I think a lot of times we don't know how we would react in a situation. So if we can kind of practice with that and think about it, it helps us when things really do happen. So I'll just give you the first example. You're looking at recent Instagram posts. You notice that a student at your school has posted an image of a Star of David and a raised middle finger with the caption, "Damn Jews." You notice that the post has close to 100 likes, some by people you know. And so it's asking, like, how would you react if you saw this post and it was from a friend? And then what if it was from an acquaintance? What if it was someone that you didn't know at your school, right? And then thinking about those relationships. My students, the last time I did this, kind of surprised me, because I would think that they would be like, with a friend, you'd say, "Oh my God, why did you post that?" You know, they were more of the thinking that they would be more apt to respond to someone they didn't know, because they felt more comfortable, especially on social media. And when they explained it, it made sense. You're invisible, right? In a way, you know, you can comment on that and not even know the person, right? And so they felt more comfortable. So anyway, it brings up some good questions, and there are different scenarios. And again, I did this as a jigsaw activity. And that was a really good one, very powerful activity. Because you want the kids to think about what they can do, right? And how they can affect change. You have more testimonies about that bring them into the present and looking at injustices today. And then you also have group action projects that you can share with your students or with your class. And I'll end with this, so different ways to take action, just giving the kids ideas, and letting them make some choices with that. All right, so that is what we have in our contemporary anti-Semitism unit. I also would encourage you to always look at the making connections for each unit, because there's so much more. It's like you can't fit everything in, and so here's some more stuff, so always check that out. Are there any questions about anything that we looked at today, or questions about how to use echoes and reflections? All right, so I'm going to put into the chat. Joan just shared the evaluation for the conference. I'm going to put one for echoes and reflections. If you could please fill that out, and then I'll put the information you need. So there's a link for echoes and reflections evaluation, and you'll need my name for it. There's my name. Yep. Did we lose people? Yeah. Oh, well, that's okay. Hopefully they'll get it.
Oh, there's Robin. Okay.
Yeah, there's Robin. That's weird. I don't know where David and Emily went. That's okay. So Robin, if you can hear me, there's another evaluation for this session. If you're able to fill it out, great. If not, not a big deal, but it'd be great if you could.
I'm pulling over so I can. Sorry, I had
Okay,
to drive
perfect.
across
Thank
town.
you.
And
No,
I'm
no
sorry, I
worries.
went
Thank
in
you
and
so much.
my phone just went in and out based on different parts of connectivity in the city. So I heard most of
Yeah.
it, and thank you so much. I teach 7th grade, so I mean this is still appropriate to use most of this in 7th grade, isn't it? Is it not?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Go through it,
Okay.
because there are a couple of activities that have like anti-Semitic images that if kids aren't mature enough, they might do wrong things with them. So
Right.
just kind of look through all the activities, but I think a lot of them you could definitely fit in to 7th grade.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I
thank
appreciate it.
you.
Thank you. I'm doing it right now.
Awesome. Okay,
Oh,
and
actually,
Joan,
you know what?
yeah.
Can you when it just disconnected me, it cleared out my chat. Can you
Oh,
resend it one more time, please?
there it is.
Thank you.
Yep, of
And
course.
it's anti-Semitism.
Contemporary, or let's see.
No, it's
Understanding
something
and
about
countering here. I'll put it
countering
in the chat
hate,
again.
right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank
Oh,
you.
no, that's okay.
They
Thanks so
just
much.
changed the names of all of them.
There you go.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
All
You're
right. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Kim, for another amazing presentation.
Yeah.
Really appreciate, I really appreciate everything that you're teaching us today. So I'm gonna go
Great.
ahead and stop the recording for this session.
Yeah. And